Good evening. Wherever you are in the world tonight, welcome. Take a slow, gentle breath and allow your thoughts to drift away with the day. I'm curious, where are you watching from tonight? And what time is it for you right now? Is the world outside already quiet? Or are you slowly preparing for rest? Tonight we travel back in time to the banks of the Nile under a sky filled with stars. A river that once carried gods, kings, and quiet dreams. You don't need to stay awake. Simply listen and let the gentle flow of the Nile guide you into sleep. When the sun set along the Nile, Egypt did not simply grow darker. It changed function. Day and night were not equal halves of time in ancient Egypt. They were different operational states of the world. Day was visibility, labor, administration, and noise. Night was compression, vigilance, restraint, and transition. When the sun lowered toward the western horizon, people did not think in terms of beauty or calm. They thought in terms of adjustment. The Nile at night was not the same river. During the day, the river was open and legible. Boats moved with confidence. Farmers worked its banks. Officials measured water levels. Fishers cast nets where they could see currents and shadows. The river belonged to human schedules. At sunset, that changed. Light withdrew quickly in Egypt. Twilight was brief. Once the sun passed below the horizon, details vanished. The Nile did not glow. It darkened into a continuous surface that hid depth, speed, and danger. For the Egyptians, this was not symbolic. It was practical. They understood that the river behaved differently at night. Currents shifted subtly. Wind patterns changed. Animals emerged. Sounds traveled farther across the water. What could be judged easily during the day became uncertain after sunset. This uncertainty demanded caution. Villages along the Nile followed predictable patterns as night approached. Tools were stored, boats were secured or prepared specifically for nocturnal travel. Fires were lit not for comfort, but for orientation and protection. Movement slowed, not because people were tired, but because errors were harder to correct in darkness. The sun's descent marked a boundary. Beyond it, different rules applied. The Egyptians described this transition in both practical and religious terms. The sun did not simply set, it entered another domain. As the solar god Ra moved beyond the visible sky, he was believed to begin his passage through the Duat. This belief was not separate from daily life. It explained why night felt different. If the sun itself had to travel through danger and darkness to return, the night was not passive time. It was active, necessary, and potentially unstable. This shaped behavior. People near the Nile did not assume safety after sunset. They respected limits. Certain tasks were avoided. Certain routes were postponed. Other activities, especially transport and ritual, were deliberately moved into the night when conditions favored them. Night concentrated attention. Sound mattered more than sight. A splash carried farther than a shout. A disturbance on the water could signal a boat, an animal, or something unseen. Silence was not emptiness. It was information. The Nile amplified this effect. Water reflects sound differently at night. The Egyptians noticed this. Fishermen knew when to remain still. Guards along river installations listened rather than watched. Travelers learned to read the river by sound and memory. The loss of light did not stop work. It changed technique. Historically, the Nile at night was a corridor of movement rather than a place of rest. Long-distance transport often favored darkness. Cooler air reduced exhaustion. Reduced visibility offered discretion. Certain goods moved more safely when observation was limited. But this movement required experience. Night travel was not casual. This is why knowledge of the river passed carefully from generation to generation. Where sandbanks lay, how currents pulled at bends, where crocodiles surfaced after dusk. These were not myths. They were survival details. Crocodiles, in particular, altered the character of the Nile at night. During the day, they could be seen and avoided. At night, they became almost invisible. Their movement was silent. Their attacks were sudden. This reality shaped belief. Sobek, the crocodile god, was not feared abstractly. He was respected because his presence was felt most strongly after dark. The Nile belonged to him at night as much as it belonged to humans during the day. The boundary between human and non-human control blurred. This blur was central to how Egyptians understood night. It was not a time when order disappeared, but a time when order was shared. Humans no longer dominated the landscape. They negotiated with it. That negotiation extended into religion. Many temples aligned rituals with sunset rather than sunrise. Offerings made at dusk acknowledged that protection was needed for the hours ahead. Amulets worn at night were practical as well as symbolic, meant to guard against animals, illness, and disorientation. Homes along the Nile were built with night in mind. Openings were limited. Roofs were used cautiously. Sleeping arrangements accounted for insects, temperature changes, and the possibility of flooding. The river could rise quietly at night. This was one of its most dangerous traits. During flood season, water advanced gradually but persistently. At night, its progress was harder to judge. Villages learned to read subtle signs, changes in smell, sound, and humidity, to anticipate movement before it reached doorways. The Nile at night demanded attentiveness. This attentiveness shaped mentality. The Egyptians did not romanticize the night river. They respected it. They accepted that it revealed what daylight concealed: vulnerability, dependence, and the limits of control. At the same time, night did not represent chaos. It represented another phase of order. Just as fields rested after harvest, the river entered a different rhythm. Human activity did not stop, it recalibrated. Life did not pause, it adapted. This belief removed panic. Night was expected, prepared for, integrated. The Nile did not threaten Egypt when the sun set. It reminded Egypt that control was temporary and shared, that survival depended on knowing when to act and when to wait. As darkness settled fully, the river became less a resource and more a presence, not hostile, not welcoming, present. This presence shaped stories, rituals, and habits that endured for thousands of years. It is why the Nile at night remained central, not only to survival, but to how Egyptians understood time itself. Day belonged to visibility. Night belonged to continuity, and the Nile flowed through both without stopping. When night settled over the Nile, authority shifted. Not politically, not socially, divinely. The ancient Egyptians did not believe the same powers governed the river by day and by night. Daylight belonged largely to human activity supported by solar order. Night belonged to gods, whose domains were less visible, more dangerous, and more intimate. The Nile at night was not unguided. It was reassigned. One of the most important gods to emerge after sunset was Sobek, Sobek was not a distant deity. He was present, physical, and immediate. His body was the crocodile, and the Nile was his territory. During the day, crocodiles could be seen and avoided. At night, they became part of the darkness itself. This made Sobek a god of hidden power. He was not worshipped to remove danger, but to regulate it. The Egyptians believed Sobek controlled which waters were safe and which were not. His favor did not guarantee protection. It guaranteed predictability. Shrines to Sobek near the Nile were not expressions of fear. They were negotiations. Offerings made at dusk acknowledged that human dominance ended with daylight. Sobek was not asked to leave. He was asked to keep balance, to allow boats to pass, to keep banks intact, to prevent sudden destruction. Sobek represented the Nile's physical threat, but he was not alone. Above the river, the moon rose, and with it came Khonsu. Khonsu governed night, not through danger, but through measurement. The Egyptians used the moon to track time, months, and cycles. At night, Khonsu's presence structured darkness. He did not illuminate the Nile completely. He outlined it. Moonlight reflected off the river's surface, revealing movement without clarity. This partial visibility mattered. It allowed navigation while preserving mystery. Khonsu did not eliminate night, he moderated it. Travelers trusted moon phases. Priests planned rituals accordingly. Certain nights were favored for journeys, others avoided. This was not superstition. It was observation turned into belief. Khonsu's role over the Nile at night was administrative. He governed duration, timing, and rhythm. Where Sobek embodied threat, Khonsu embodied schedule. Together, they defined night travel. But deeper still was the influence of Hapi. Hapi was the god of the Nile's fertility, flooding, and abundance. Unlike Sobek, Hapi was not dangerous. Unlike Khonsu, he was not distant. He was constant, but his presence changed with light. At night, Hapi was believed to move unseen. Floodwaters often advanced quietly after sunset. Moisture crept into soil. Channels filled slowly. The Egyptians attributed this silent expansion to Hapi's nocturnal labor. Hapi worked best when unseen. This belief reinforced respect for night. The most important work of the Nile, renewing the land, did not happen under observation. It happened quietly, incrementally, often while people slept. The Nile rose at night. Crops benefited by morning. This reinforced the idea that divine activity increased after sunset. Above all of these gods moves the solar god Ra, now transformed. At night, Ra did not disappear from the Nile's story. He entered it differently. As Ra traveled through the Duat, the Nile became a reflection of his journey. The river mirrored the solar bark's hidden passage. Night currents echoed cosmic currents. What happened in the heavens repeated on the water. This connection mattered. The Egyptians believed the Nile was not just a river. It was a cosmic artery. Its behavior reflected the condition of the universe. When the Nile behaved predictably at night, it meant Ra's journey was proceeding correctly. When disturbances occurred, unusual sounds, strange movements, unexpected flooding, people worried not just about local danger, but about cosmic imbalance. This is why night rituals near the Nile often addressed multiple gods simultaneously. A single offering could be directed to Sobek for restraint, to Khonsu for timing, to Hapi for nourishment, and indirectly to Ra for continuity. Night demanded cooperation among gods. No single deity dominated completely. This divine plurality mirrored human vulnerability. At night, no single strategy guaranteed safety. People relied on layers: knowledge, caution, ritual, and belief. Even lesser deities played roles after sunset. Protective gods guarded thresholds. Spirits associated with illness and water were believed to roam more freely. Amulets worn at night often invoked multiple names, not because one god was insufficient, but because night was shared territory. The Nile after dark was not abandoned by the divine. It was crowded with forces that did not compete but overlapped. This overlap explains why Egyptian religion rarely portrayed night gods as villains. They were necessary. Without them, night would be empty, and emptiness was more frightening than danger. Danger could be respected. Emptiness could not. By attributing specific roles to gods of the night Nile, the Egyptians made darkness intelligible. Each sound, each movement, each uncertainty had a possible divine explanation. This did not eliminate risk. It eliminated panic. People slept knowing the gods were active, that the river was watched, that processes continued even without human oversight. The Nile at night was not uncontrolled. It was governed differently, and this difference shaped how Egyptians understood balance. Power did not belong permanently to humans, nor permanently to gods. It shifted with time, light, and condition. Daylight returned authority to people. Night returned authority to gods. The river accepted both. As darkness deepened, divine presence became less symbolic and more immediate. The Nile ceased to be a tool and became a domain. One entered it carefully, spoke to it respectfully, and listened more than acted. This divine order of night did not isolate humans. It included them as participants, not rulers. And as the night continued, human settlements withdrew slightly from the river's edge, not in fear, but in recognition. The gods had taken their turn. The Nile would be returned by morning. And the Nile darkened fully. Stories moved along it. Not stories told aloud, but stories understood, patterns remembered, events expected, meanings carried quietly from one generation to the next. The Egyptians believed the river at night became a stage where divine actions unfolded repeatedly, not as performances, but as necessary events. One of the oldest stories told about the Nile at night concerned Ra and his hidden passage. According to temple tradition, Ra's solar bark did not travel beneath the earth alone. As it entered the Duat, its movement was mirrored on the Nile itself. Priests believed that when the river grew unusually still at night, Ra was passing through a dangerous hour of his journey. When currents shifted suddenly, it signaled resistance somewhere in the unseen realm. There are accounts carved on temple walls describing nights when rituals were intensified along the riverbanks, because Ra's passage was believed to be under threat. Fires were kept burning. Hymns were recited facing the water. These acts were meant to reinforce order, not through spectacle, but through alignment. The river carried the echo of the sun's struggle. Another widely known story involved Sobek, whose presence was strongest after sunset. One myth tells of a night when Sobek rose fully from the Nile near a settlement that had neglected its offerings. Crocodiles moved closer to shore than usual. Boats struck unseen obstacles. Nets were torn apart. The priests did not interpret this as punishment. They understood it as imbalance. Offerings resumed the following evening. Meat and bread were placed near the water. Names were spoken carefully. Within days, the river's behavior returned to its familiar rhythm. Crocodiles withdrew to deeper channels. Stories like this were not about fear. They were about response. Sobek was believed to regulate the boundary between human activity and the river's own life. Night was when that boundary softened. The story reminded people that access to the Nile depended on continued respect. There were also quieter stories, ones involving Isis. Isis was associated with the Nile at night through healing and protection. One myth describes Isis traveling along the river after dark, searching for the scattered remains of Osiris. As she moved, the water was said to grow calm where she passed, allowing her boat to glide without disturbance. Women living near the Nile invoked Isis at night during illness, childbirth, or loss. Water drawn from the river after sunset was sometimes kept aside for ritual washing, believed to carry protective qualities associated with her presence. These practices linked night water with restoration. The Nile did not only carry danger and darkness, it also carried repair. Another story, preserved in lunar hymns, involved Khonsu, who was believed to walk the sky above the river, while his influence traced patterns on the water below. One myth describes Khonsu slowing the moon's movement during a night of unrest, extending darkness so that balance could be restored before dawn. This delay was said to prevent misfortune from spilling into daylight. Sailors paid close attention to moon position during night travel. Certain stretches of the Nile were crossed only under specific lunar phases. These customs were justified through stories of Khonsu guiding boats safely by maintaining rhythm in the sky and river alike. The moon's reflection on the Nile was treated as guidance rather than illumination. Further south, stories centered on Hapi took prominence. Hapi's nocturnal work was rarely dramatic. Myths describe him moving silently through channels, adjusting floodwaters with measured care. One tale speaks of Hapi delaying the rise of the river by a single night to allow farmers time to secure their fields. These stories emphasized patience. The Nile did not surge impulsively. It responded to timing. At night, Hapi's influence was believed to be strongest because human interference diminished. Without noise, measurement, and activity, the river returned briefly to divine management. There were also stories told among boatmen about encounters on the night river. Figures seen briefly at the edge of vision, voices carried across water, lights that moved without explanation. These were often attributed to minor deities or river spirits whose presence became noticeable after sunset. Such stories reinforced caution without hysteria. A careful traveler acknowledged what could not be fully seen. The gods were present, but not intrusive. They occupied the night Nile the way currents occupy water, consistently, invisibly, and with consequence. One recurring narrative described a night when Ra's bark aligned perfectly with the Nile's flow. That night, winds were favorable, waters calm, and travel unusually smooth. The following day, harvests were abundant and illness was rare. This story reinforced the idea that cosmic order and river order were linked. When one moved correctly, so did the other. Importantly, these stories were not isolated myths. They were integrated explanations. They explained why certain nights felt different, why some journeys succeeded effortlessly, while others failed without obvious reason, why rituals were repeated consistently, even when nothing seemed wrong. The Egyptians did not need constant divine intervention. They needed continuity. Stories provided that continuity. At night, when visibility diminished and certainty weakened, Stories filled the gap. They did not excite. They stabilized. Knowing that the gods were active according to established patterns made uncertainty manageable. This is why stories of the Nile at night endured for centuries with little alteration. Their value was not novelty, it was reliability. As darkness deepened along the river, these stories were not always spoken aloud. Often, they were simply remembered. Remembering itself was an act of alignment. To remember how the gods behaved was to behave correctly oneself. And so the Nile carried these stories, quietly, night after night, without interruption, just as it carried water, silt, and life. Night travel on the Nile existed long before it was written about. The river did not close when the sun set, it changed hands. During daylight, human planning shaped movement. After dark, movement followed patterns believed to be older than Egypt itself. Stories about the gods explain these patterns not as metaphors, but as guidance learned over time. Boatmen spoke first of Ra, whose journey through the unseen world was believed to run parallel to the river's own nocturnal rhythm. As Ra entered the Duat, his solar bark moved through darkness with assistance from divine companions. On the Nile, this belief translated into practice. Boats traveling after sunset moved slowly, kept steady spacing, and avoided sudden changes of direction. The rhythm of rowing followed established timing rather than speed. These habits were justified by stories describing moments when Ra's passage required stability. Sudden movement on the river was believed to disturb balance. Calm travel allowed alignment between river and sky. Night crossings were planned carefully. Certain stretches of the Nile were crossed only after moonrise, others before. These choices were linked to the movement of Khonsu, whose presence governed timing. Khonsu's role in myth was to regulate cycles. On the river, his influence shaped departure times, rest points, and pavas. Boatmen paid attention to moon position rather than brightness. The angle of reflection on the water indicated current strength and depth changes. These observations became associated with Khonsu's guidance. Stories described him adjusting the pace of the night so travelers could reach safe banks before dawn. Another group of stories centered on Sobek. Night travel brought humans closer to Sobek's domain. Crocodiles hunted after dark, moved silently, and occupied channels that were navigable during the day. Myths describing Sobek's behavior at night reinforced caution. One story told among river communities described a trading vessel that ignored established night routes. The boat struck a submerged obstruction and drifted into shallow water. Crocodiles approached, drawn by sound. The crew escaped only after abandoning cargo. The incident was later attributed to failure to acknowledge Sobek before departure. Following such stories, night travel rituals became standard. Small offerings were placed near the water. Names were spoken quietly. These actions were not dramatic. They were practical acknowledgments of shared space. Sobek's stories emphasized boundaries. Night travel required awareness of where human activity ended and river life dominated. Boats stayed midstream where possible. Banks were avoided. Sounds were minimized. Other stories involved Isis, whose association with the Nile at night focused on protection during movement. Isis was believed to guide those traveling with purpose rather than haste. Her myths often placed her on the river after sunset, moving steadily while carrying knowledge or restoring balance. Travelers invoked Isis before long journeys, especially when carrying fragile goods or accompanying the sick. Water drawn from the Nile at night was sometimes used to anoint boats, believed to encourage smooth passage. These practices linked safety to intention. Travel undertaken with care aligned with divine order. Reckless movement disrupted it. Stories also described encounters during night travel that were never fully explained. Lights seen briefly on the water, shapes moving along banks, voices carried across the river without visible source. These accounts were not sensationalized. They were treated as reminders that the night river contained more than human presence. Minor deities and river spirits featured in these stories. Their role was to observe rather than intervene. Acknowledging them meant traveling attentively. Ignoring them increased risk. Night journeys were often silent. Speech carried far over water. Boatmen communicated through gestures or brief signals. This behavior aligned with myths describing gods who favored restraint. Noise attracted attention. Quiet allowed passage. Cargo transport followed similar principles. Grain, stone, and valuable materials moved under color of darkness for practical reasons, including cooler temperatures and reduced traffic. These reasons were reinforced by stories suggesting divine preference for certain movements at night. One narrative described Ra's bark passing through a narrow region of the Duat, where sound caused resistance. Priests interpreted this as guidance for river travel. Silence reduced obstacles. Smooth movement followed. Over time, these stories shaped a culture of night navigation that combined myth and experience. The Nile became predictable at night through familiarity rather than control. The gods in these stories did not command travelers. They established conditions. Movement that respected those conditions succeeded more often. Night travel was never casual. It required memory, patience, and adherence to inherited knowledge. Stories preserved that knowledge. These stories were repeated because they worked. They explained why certain practices reduced accidents. They provided reasons for restraint. They framed caution as alignment rather than fear. As a result, the Nile at night remained active without becoming chaotic. Boats moved. Trade continued. Communication flowed. The river did not empty after sunset. It shifted into a different mode, a mode governed by gods whose stories emphasized timing, boundary, and balance. When dawn approached, boats reached familiar banks. Fires were rekindled. The river returned to daylight rhythm. Night stories receded until needed again. They waited in memory, ready to guide the next journey. Death along the Nile rarely occurred in isolation. It happened near water, because water shaped Egyptian life from birth onward. Villages clustered close to the river. Fields depended on it. Trade followed it. When death came, it often came within reach of the Nile, and at night its presence felt closer. The Egyptians believed that water eased transition. This belief shaped how gods were understood when death touched the river after sunset. One of the central figures in these beliefs was Osiris. Osiris was not imagined as distant from the Nile. His story unfolded through water, dismemberment, and recovery along riverbanks. At night, the Nile was thought to echo the earliest moments of his myth. Temple traditions describe Osiris's body being carried by water before it was gathered and restored. Because of this, the Nile at night became associated with containment of the dead, not with abandonment. Water held what land could not. When someone died near the river, especially after sunset, families often believed Osiris was already present. The river marked a threshold. The body had left life, but the soul had not yet moved onward. The night Nile served as a holding space where transition could occur without rupture. This belief influenced funerary practice. Bodies were not rushed away from the river immediately. Lamps were lit, names were spoken, silence was maintained. These acts acknowledged that death was unfolding within a sacred corridor shaped by gods. Another god closely associated with death on the river was Anubis. Anubis was understood as a guide between states, and the Nile at night was one of the spaces where his guidance was most needed. Stories described Anubis smoothing along riverbanks after dark, ensuring that the dead did not drift or fragment before proper rites began. In these accounts, Anubis did not remove the dead immediately. He stabilized them. This stabilization allowed families time to prepare ritual, to gather materials, and to orient the soul correctly. The river assisted in this process. Its steady movement mirrored the gradual separation between body and awareness. At night, this movement was less visible but more present. Sound carried, moisture cooled the air. These conditions supported stillness. Death required stillness. The Nile provided it. There were also stories involving deaths that occurred on the river. Boat accidents, drownings, or encounters with animals. These deaths were treated differently from deaths on land. Such events were associated strongly with Sobek. Sobek's connection to death on the river was acknowledged openly. Crocodile attacks were rare but decisive. When they occurred at night, they reinforced belief that Sobek had claimed what belonged to the river. Families did not accuse Sobek. They interpreted these deaths as boundary crossings. The person had entered a space where human control weakened. Sobek's role was to maintain the river's order, not to spare individuals. Offerings followed such events, not as apology, but as recognition. The body, if recovered, was treated with care. If not recovered, the river itself became part of the funerary context. Names were spoken toward the water. Lamps floated briefly on the surface. These acts acknowledged that the Nile now participated in the transition. The Egyptians did not believe souls drowned. They believed souls transferred. Water facilitated this transfer. There were also beliefs linking death at night on the Nile to the broader journey through the Duat. The river's darkness resembled the first stages of that journey. Quiet movement, reduced visibility, and reliance on memory rather than sight prepared the soul for what followed. This connection made the Nile a place of familiarity rather than fear. Priests sometimes performed rites near the water after sunset for those who had died earlier that day. These rites invoked Osiris and Anubis together, acknowledging that death required both authority and guidance. Osiris ensured placement, Anubis ensured direction. The Nile supported both. Another layer of belief involved Isis, whose presence was associated with protection of the vulnerable dead. Isis was believed to guard the deceased during the interval before burial. Water drawn from the river at night was sometimes used in purification rites connected to her. Death did not isolate the individual from the living community. It extended community responsibility. The river connected households, temples, and burial grounds. At night, this connection felt stronger because activity quieted and attention narrowed. The Nile carried sound, memory, and ritual more clearly in darkness. Stories also describe encounters between the living and the dead along the river at night. These were not tales of haunting. They were accounts of recognition, a presence felt briefly, a familiar sound, a dream later linked to a moment near the water. Such experiences were attributed to souls still orienting themselves. Anubis was believed to prevent these presences from lingering. The river acted as a boundary that allowed brief overlap but prevented entanglement. Once rites progressed, the overlap faded. This belief reduced anxiety. The dead did not remain indefinitely. They moved onward. The Nile assisted this movement because it was always moving. Even in apparent stillness, it carried direction. This quality made it an ideal medium for transition. Burial grounds near the river were positioned deliberately. Proximity to water eased transport. It also symbolized participation in cosmic movement. The dead were not placed randomly. They were placed within a system that mirrored divine journeys. Night intensified this symbolism. Darkness removed distraction. Rituals performed at night focused attention. Gods associated with death were considered closer. The river's presence reinforced their roles. These practices endured because they aligned with lived experience. Death near the Nile was common. Water shaped outcomes. Night changed perception. Belief provided structure. By framing death on the river as guided by gods rather than ruled by chance, the Egyptians preserved calm. Grief existed, but panic did not dominate. The process continued. The Nile did not interrupt life when death occurred. It absorbed it. As night deepened, lamps dimmed, and the river returned to its steady flow. The dead were acknowledged. The gods were invoked. Transition proceeded. By morning, attention shifted back to the living world. Fields required tending. Boats required loading. The river resumed its daylight role. Death had been integrated. The gods had done their work, and the Nile continued, carrying both memory and motion without pause. Night along the Nile was never empty. It was active, and much of that activity carried risk. The Egyptians did not separate danger from meaning. What threatened life was often understood as part of a larger structure governed by gods, seasons, and balance. Floods were the most powerful of these forces. The Nile's inundation did not announce itself loudly. During flood season, water advanced slowly, often most noticeably at night, without sunlight to reveal changing shorelines. Villages relied on sound, smell, and memory to judge how close the river had come. Water lapping against new surfaces, mud softening beneath walls, insects gathering where none had been before. These signs mattered. The Egyptians believed floodwaters were directed by Hapi, whose work was quiet and deliberate. At night, Hapi's influence was considered strongest. Human interference paused. Measurements ceased. The river adjusted itself. Floods were not viewed as attacks. They were corrections. Still, danger existed. Houses too close to the river could be overtaken. Storage areas flooded. Boats broke loose. At night, response time was limited. This made vigilance essential. Villages organized night watches during flood season. Fires were kept low but visible. Elevated ground was prepared in advance. These actions were practical, yet they were also reinforced by belief. Watching the river was a form of respect. Animals added another layer of risk. Crocodiles were the most feared, and their activity increased after sunset. They hunted silently, often near shallow banks and crossing points. Encounters at night were abrupt and decisive. These dangers were associated with Sobek, whose role was to maintain the river's balance. Crocodiles removed weak animals and disrupted careless behavior. Their presence reminded people that the Nile was shared territory. Hippos posed a different threat. Unlike crocodiles, hippos often moved onto land at night to feed. They were territorial and unpredictable. Damage to crops and boats occurred frequently during their nocturnal movements. Injuries caused by hippos were common and severe. The Egyptians associated these animals with uncontrolled force rather than malice. Night amplified their presence because human activity retreated. Fields lay quiet. Paths emptied. Animals reclaimed space temporarily. Snakes, insects, and scavengers also became more active. Bites and illness increased after sunset, especially near stagnant water. Protective measures included raised sleeping platforms, nets, and amulets. These were everyday responses to nightly risk. Belief and practice overlapped closely. Danger was never denied. It was anticipated. Myths helped explain why these dangers followed patterns. Crocodiles appeared in certain channels. Floodwaters reached predictable limits. Animals avoided some areas and favored others. These observations became stories tied to divine behavior. Night danger was not random. It followed structure. This understanding reduced fear. When danger has pattern, it can be managed. The Egyptians did not expect safety. They expected order. When accidents occurred, explanations did not rely on chance. A boat overturned because conditions were ignored. A person wandered too close to the water. A ritual was delayed. Responsibility was distributed across human action and divine rhythm. This mindset mattered deeply. It prevented paralysis. Communities adapted continuously. Routes shifted seasonally. Storage moved upward. Night activity adjusted to river behavior. Belief provided continuity across generations. Children learned early that night near the Nile required awareness. Stories reinforced this lesson. Elders spoke of floods remembered, animals encountered, villages relocated. These accounts carried authority because they aligned with lived experience. The gods were not blamed for danger. They were understood as participants. The Nile did not turn hostile after sunset. It revealed aspects of itself that daylight concealed. Danger was one of those aspects. Life along the river continued because people accepted this reality rather than resisting it. They did not attempt to dominate night conditions. They learned to move within them. This approach extended into religion. Gods associated with night danger were respected without hysteria. Offerings were made regularly. Boundaries were observed. Silence was maintained where needed. The river responded. Over time, this balance allowed Egypt to survive repeated floods, animal threats, and environmental uncertainty. Night danger did not weaken society. It trained it. As dawn approached, animal movement receded. Floodwaters stabilized. Human activity resumed. The river shifted back into its daytime role. The dangers of night did not vanish. They withdrew. They would return again. And when they did, the system would already be in place to meet them. The Nile at night mattered because it revealed how ancient Egypt understood balance. Daylight showed what people controlled. Night showed what they shared, with gods, animals, seasons, and the river itself. This division was not a weakness in Egyptian thinking. It was a strength. It allowed life to continue without the illusion of constant mastery. The Egyptians did not imagine the Nile as a passive resource. They understood it as a living system that changed roles across time. Night was when that system asserted itself most clearly. Human activity narrowed, divine influence widened. The river continued regardless. This rhythm shaped behavior. People planned work with night in mind. Travel schedules, storage practices, settlement placement, and ritual timing all reflected the expectation that darkness altered conditions. This expectation reduced surprise. Reduced surprise reduced panic. Myth supported this understanding by assigning responsibility without removing realism. Gods did not eliminate danger. They explained why danger followed patterns. Sobek accounted for animals. Hapi accounted for floods. Khonsu accounted for timing. Osiris accounted for death and continuation. Each role was specific. Together, they formed a framework that made night intelligible. The Nile at night also mattered because it trained attention. Sound replaced sight. Memory replaced immediacy. Experience replaced impulse. These skills were not optional. They were required to live beside a river that could sustain or destroy. Over generations, this produced a culture comfortable with limits. Egyptian society did not depend on constant expansion. It depended on maintenance. Night emphasized maintenance over action. Waiting became as important as doing. Observation mattered as much as effort. This attitude extended into religion, politics, and daily life. Kings ruled by day, but order was preserved at night by systems older than any ruler. The Nile flowed through both realms without interruption. The gods associated with the Night River did not dominate attention. They structured it. Their stories reminded people when to act, when to pause, and when to withdraw. These reminders accumulated into habit. Habit preserved stability. Even death fit into the structure. When someone died near the river, the Night Nile absorbed the moment without disorder. Rites followed established paths. Grief existed, but it moved within expectation. Loss did not unravel the system. This ability to integrate disruption explains much of Egypt's longevity. Floods, famine, political change, and foreign rule all occurred. The Nile continued to flow. Night continued to come. The framework held. The Nile at night was not romanticized. It was respected. Respect produced continuity. By morning, the river returned to daylight function. Boats launched, fields reopened, administration resumed. What happened at night did not interrupt the next day. It supported it. This continuity mattered more than comfort. The Egyptians accepted that some things operated beyond sight, trusting that unseen processes functioned correctly, allowed people to rest, to sleep, and to prepare for what followed. That trust was earned nightly. The river proved it again and again. Understanding the Nile at night is therefore not about fear or mystery. It is about recognizing how ancient Egypt balanced human intention with natural and divine rhythm. Night was not an enemy. It was a phase, and the Nile belonged to all of its phases. If you want more long-form ancient history stories told calmly and clearly, subscribe to the channel and like the video. More journeys along rivers, myths, and forgotten worlds are already on their way. For now, the river continues, and the night passes as it always has.